Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Quick note, I released a supporter-only episode last week on the corrosive legacy of Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. If you'd like to hear that episode and all my other supporter-only episodes, join me on patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe directly through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Okay. Let's try a thought experiment. Let's project ourselves forward a couple of decades to the mid-2040s. You wake up for work, but instead of grabbing your keys, you step into a quiet pod waiting at the curb. There's no steering wheel, no driver's seat, just a lounge-like interior with a desk, a couch, even a small espresso bar in the corner. The pod slides silently into traffic, joining a river of other autonomous vehicles that flow like cells through the bloodstream of the city. As you sip your coffee, you log into your company's network, or perhaps you relax to read. Maybe you doze off as the car drives itself. Now, imagine a different morning. Instead of a pod waiting outside, you slip on a headset. Or maybe it isn't even a headset. By then, perhaps it's a pair of light, stylish glasses, or even a set of implants so subtle you forget you're wearing them. Within seconds, your senses are bathed in an environment indistinguishable from reality. You walk into a virtual office where your colleagues, scattered across the globe, sit at the same table with you. Or maybe you see your mother in another city and hug her, feeling the weight and warmth through haptic feedback. Or perhaps you attend a concert in Tokyo without ever leaving your living room. These are two parallel futures that loom before us. One built on the radical mobility of bodies through self-driving vehicles, and the other on the radical substitution of presence through immersive virtual reality. Both promise to reshape our lives. But what happens if they mature together? Do they compete or converge? Do we become a society of nomads moving constantly in luxurious autonomous lounges? Or a society of homebodies plugged into a world that makes movement unnecessary altogether? This tension between parallel technological paradigms, between different ways the future might be built, isn't new. History is littered with forks in the road where competing technologies could have carried us into very different worlds. And studying those crossroads is one of the best ways to sharpen our sense of what lies ahead. So, in this episode, I want to explore a few such moments from history. We'll look at the contest between railroads and cars, between airships and airplanes, and between AC and DC electricity. We'll also touch briefly on the telegraph and the telephone. Each case reveals how technological choices don't just change tools, they reshape landscapes, societies, the entire experience of life in the modern world. And once we appreciate just how historically contingent those choices were, we can better imagine the consequences of alternative technological paths in our own time, when parallel paradigms like autonomous vehicles and virtual reality are both racing toward maturity. Let's begin with the most familiar of all, cars versus rail. For most of the 19th century, railroads were the arteries of civilization. They stitched together continents, carried goods, carried armies, carried businessmen. Towns rose where rail lines ran and withered where they didn't. By the early 20th century, rail seemed not only dominant, but permanent, the inevitable backbone of modern transport. And it wasn't just long-distance freight or passenger lines. Cities from New York to Los Angeles were laced with streetcars and trolleys and subways. You could board a tram in a small Midwestern town and be delivered, after a few changes, right into the heart of Chicago. Rail was relatively clean, efficient, and remarkably scalable. Railroads also attracted staggering levels of investment. Between the 1850s and the early 1900s, more than half of all U.S. capital formation went into laying track, buying locomotives, and building depots. Rail wasn't just an industry, it was the largest economic enterprise America had ever known. And yet, within a single generation, the car eclipsed it. Henry Ford's Model T, rolled out in 1908, promised not just transport, but a radically new form of freedom. No schedules, no fixed lines, no waiting on the platform. The car meant the open road. It meant that any horizon was suddenly within reach. At first, cars and rail coexisted. Many people owned cars but still relied on trains for long distance travel. But after World War II, the United States made a fateful infrastructural choice. It poured billions of dollars into highways, subsidized suburban development, and taxed rail into decline. The 1956 Interstate Highway Act alone funneled the equivalent of $500 billion in today's money into concrete and asphalt, mobilizing millions of construction jobs and locking in the car's dominance. By the 1960s, streetcars had vanished from most cities, ripped out in favor of bus lines or simply abandoned. Think about the consequences. If rail had remained dominant, America would look entirely different. Our cities would be denser, more walkable. Our energy use would be far lower. The suburbs as we know them, endless grids of single family homes, each with its two-car garage, might never have emerged. Instead, we would live more like the Europeans or Japanese, clustered around rail hubs, commuting regionally by train and walking to shops and schools. Drive-throughs probably wouldn't be a thing. The obesity epidemic might never have become so dire. Our entire geography, physical and cultural, has been shaped by the choice to develop the ecosystem of the car. As a choice, America's car culture wasn't inevitable. As historian Vaclav Smil reminds us in his sweeping histories of energy and civilization, technological choices hinge on politics and economics as much as on technical merit. America chose cars through marketing and subsidies and zoning and oil politics, just as other nations chose rail. Parallel paradigms don't always coexist like this. Sometimes one wins and the entire world bends to its shape. In America, rail had to adapt to the spaces in between America's automotive dominance. It still has an important niche in our economy, but trains run very much in the background of most Americans' experience. Now, let's consider another case, less obvious today, but once an important question: airships versus airplanes. In the 1920s and early 1930s, rigid airships, Zeppelins as they were called after their German pioneer, were the marvels of the sky. Most people today call these craft blimps. 100 years ago, these rigid airships, like the infamous Hindenburg, based in Germany, offered regularly scheduled passenger service across the Atlantic Ocean, with trips connecting hubs like Frankfurt, Germany, and Lakehurst, New Jersey, just outside New York City. Boarding one of these ships felt less like entering a machine than stepping into a floating hotel. The vessel stretched the length of 2 football fields, rising almost silently into the clouds. Inside, passengers dined at white tablecloth restaurants with silver service, strolled along promenade decks lined with panoramic windows, and reclined in leather chairs while stewards poured wine. There was even a pressurized smoking lounge lined with asbestos where guests could light up a cigar while suspended thousands of feet above the ocean. The trip from Germany to New Jersey took about 3 days, a miracle compared to the week or more required by an ocean vessel. And compared to the cramped, rattling cabins of contemporary airplanes, the voyage was smooth, spacious, and glamorous, like first class on steroids. Airplanes, by contrast, were noisy, cramped, and dangerous. They bounced with turbulence, required massive runways, and carried far fewer passengers. In those early years, it wasn't obvious at all that airplanes would dominate. Many imagined a future where airship towers rose from city centers, where you could step off a train, ascend a gangplank, and float to another continent. Our skies might have become positively filled with blimps. Germany invested enormous sums into Zeppelin works at Friedrichshafen, building massive hangars and employing thousands of engineers and craftsmen to perfect lighter-than-air travel. The future of the skies was, for a time, genuinely up for grabs. But speed proved decisive. Airplanes grew faster, their range extended, their safety improved, and war pushed them forward. In both world wars, military imperatives made speed and maneuverability non-negotiable. Governments poured resources into engine design, aerodynamics, navigation systems, and radar, advancing planes by the equivalent of decades in just a few years. By the time peace returned, airplanes were not only faster, but battle-tested, with vast infrastructures of airfields and supply chains already in place. What's more, the Hindenburg disaster in 1937, just prior to World War II, caused public trust in airships to collapse virtually overnight. The Hindenburg not only burst into flames over New Jersey, the entire crash was broadcast in horrifying detail on live radio. In the post-war world, the paradigm of the airship had definitively closed, and the age of jets had begun. Here, too, imagine the alternative. A world of airships might have made long-distance travel more leisurely, more social, less about speed and more about style. Globalization might have felt slower. The world might have continued to feel like a big place, where the long distances between cultures still mattered in a deep structural and psychological sense. Instead, the airplane shrank the globe, collapsing New York to Paris into a single day's hop, and our experience of geography shrank accordingly. Now, let's turn to a case that seems more technically obscure, but is perhaps the most consequential of all: AC versus DC electricity. When Thomas Edison unveiled his system of direct current in the 1880s, he envisioned a world of neighborhood generators, each powering a few city blocks. Direct current worked, but it could only be transmitted over very short distances. Electricity loses energy as heat when it flows through a wire, and the only way to reduce that loss is to transmit at very high voltages, then step it back down for safe use at point of service. With direct current, that kind of transformation was nearly impossible at the time, so DC lines wasted huge amounts of energy if you tried to send power more than a mile or two. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse championed alternating current instead, which could be stepped up to high voltages for long-distance travel and stepped down for use when it reached point of service. Unlike a world of direct current featuring electric generators on every city block and neighborhood cul-de-sac, a world of alternating current meant centralized electric power plants and vast power grids. The so-called War of the Currents was bitter and even theatrical at times. Thomas Edison staged public electrocutions of animals using alternating current in his attempts to scare the public into outlawing its municipal use. Westinghouse fought back with demonstrations of AC's reach. In the end, AC triumphed, not because it was safer, but because it scaled. You could build giant power plants, link entire regions, and light up whole cities. By the early 1900s, companies like Westinghouse and General Electric were employing tens of thousands of workers, backed by financiers like J.P. Morgan, to lay the backbone of what became the modern power grid. For its day, this was an industrial mobilization on the scale of the interstate highway system half a century later. Let's imagine the parallel universe where DC won out. Every neighborhood would have its own generating station. And because electricity would be hyper local, rural areas might have lagged for decades, waiting for generators to be installed. Whole industries might have clustered around local power sources. Our world of continental grids, of power surging from dams and coal plants and nuclear plants hundreds of miles away, would never have taken shape. Historian Thomas Hughes, in his classic book Networks of Power, published in 1983, shows how these infrastructural decisions, AC grids, highways, airports, don't just deliver services, they mold society. They determine whether we sprawl or cluster, whether we live fast or slow, whether power, electric power, political power, economic power, is local or centralized. And once a paradigm locks in, it takes on the illusion of having been inevitable in some sense, like it was the only reasonable trajectory for our technologically advancing society. But this is far from the case. There are many equally compelling alternative directions our society could have gone at every step of the way, ramifying radically different versions of modern life. And down every one of those roads not taken, the people living there would have assumed that their technological paradigm was inevitable. That, of course, blimps won out over jets, or that trains won out over cars. This pattern is everywhere in the history of technology. Consider the telegraph and the telephone. For decades, long-distance communication meant text. Concise, coded, stripped down to essentials. And it could have stayed that way. There were plenty of reasons why the telephone might never have taken off. Telegraph companies had already built vast networks and had every incentive to protect them. Businesses had invested heavily in clerks trained to send and receive Morse code. Regulators might have favored the reliability of text over the unpredictability of voice. Even the economics of wiring cities and homes made it plausible that the telegraph could have remained the backbone of global communication. What would that have looked like? The irony, of course, is that after a century of telephone dominance, we've now looped back to text in the age of smartphones and email. But because we took that detour through the telephone era, our written communication today is shaped less by concision and discipline than by the habits of talk. It's casual, fragmentary, and emotionally caricatured. If we had stayed in a telegraph-first world, our text culture might have been sharper, more deliberate, even more literary. So, what do all these historical case studies of crossroads and parallel technological universes teach us about our current moment vis-a-vis autonomous mobility and fully immersive virtual reality? Well, first of all, they show that parallel paradigms often do coexist for a while. Cars and rail shared the transportation network for decades. Airships and airplanes filled the skies together for a generation or two. AC and DC both powered cities for a while. Telegraphs and telephones overlapped. But in every case, eventually, one paradigm did bend society more completely to its own logic, shaping infrastructure, culture, and imagination accordingly, until the alternative paradigm withered away almost entirely. The second thing this history shows is that what determines our path forward isn't always technical superiority. Cars were dirtier and less efficient than trains. Airships were smoother and more comfortable than planes. DC was safer in some ways than AC. Betamax, for that matter, was higher quality than VHS. In our world, what wins is usually what scales the fastest, what integrates the most seamlessly, and what captures the public trust and political will most aggressively. And finally, those case studies confirm that once one particular technological paradigm locks in, it usually takes on the illusion of inevitability, so much so that we come to take the technology for granted. Who among us remains surprised that our skies are not filled with floating blimp lounges? Who is walking around marveling that there is not a municipal electricity generator humming on every street corner? And yet, history is full of these phantom worlds. Here in the mid 2020s, we stand at another such fork in the road of technology. Down one road, autonomous vehicles promise to transform our mobility. Down the other, fully immersive virtual reality promises to dissolve the need for movement practically altogether. If autonomous vehicles win, our cities may double down on their constant motion. Cars themselves will become offices, gyms, living rooms on wheels. Commutes will no longer feel wasted. Highways will hum with productivity. Fatal accidents, once in the tens of thousands annually, will plummet. The very shape of our built environment, parking lots, garages, traffic lights, may be fundamentally redesigned to embrace whole new slices of life in motion. Like the car before it, the autonomous vehicle would re-script geography itself. Already, automakers and tech firms together have invested over $100 billion into this future, employing tens of thousands of engineers and testing fleets of autonomous vehicles in dozens of cities. Governments are beginning to adapt laws and insurance frameworks. The infrastructure is bending slowly to prepare. If virtual reality wins, mass movement might fade into memory just like the telegraph and the passenger train. Why drive across town when you can meet your friend in a virtual cafe indistinguishable from a real one? Why fly across the country for a meeting when you can sit across from your colleague in a shared simulation? In that world, the body stays put while the mind roams free. Our physical infrastructure might shrink, even as our virtual infrastructure explodes. Meta has already spent more than $40 billion on this vision. Apple has entered with its Vision Pro. Sony, Microsoft, and countless startups employ tens of thousands to push forward haptics, optics, and artificial intelligence. The parallel is clear. Just as rail barons and auto tycoons, just as Zeppelin engineers and aircraft manufacturers, just as Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse fought to define the modern world, so too are today's companies waging colossal battles over what kind of reality we will inhabit. What's likely, at least for the foreseeable future, is that both paradigms will mature alongside each other in a shared ecosystem of evolving technological culture. We will travel in autonomous lounges when physical experience matters, trying out a new winery, celebrating together at a restaurant, heading to grandma's house for Sunday night dinner where the cousins can run wild. But we'll slip into virtual worlds during a lot of our day-to-day, for most of our work, our education, our entertainment, and our casual social connection. Just as cars never eliminated trains, virtual reality will probably never eliminate movement, but it will change its meaning fundamentally. The point is not to predict which future will win out, but to notice the pattern, to see that the investments, regulations, and cultural habits we choose today will bend the arc of society in ways that shape how our grandchildren live at the deepest structural level. And so, once again, the real question isn't just technical, it's cultural. What kind of life do we want for our grandchildren? What kind of world would we want them to inhabit? One of radical mobility or radical simulation? One of lounges in motion or of living rooms that contain whole universes? Hopefully, we can build the best of both worlds. But the key, what history shows, is that neither is inevitable, even though it will probably seem like that to them. I'm Brad Harris. So long.